For the first time since she was acquitted for the murder of her daughter, Casey Anthony speaks up in a documentary titled Casey Anthony, Where the Truth Lies. But what does her body language, word choice, and overall behavior reveal? Are these the words of a mother looking for answers? Is there more to this story? And why does this internet search suggest a disturbing realization? Hey everyone, welcome to the Behavioral Arts. My name is Spidey and I use my degree in sociology and psychology, my certifications in criminal interrogation and body language analysis, and over 10 years experience as an award-winning mentalist to teach people behavioral analysis and practical psychology on stages and TV shows all over the world. In this video, we are diving into part 3 of the documentary Casey Anthony, Where the Truth Lies, and there is a lot going on in part 3. We get more details about her childhood. We get more details about what happened to Caylee, which is a very different story than was presented by her legal team in court, and we're going to look at all that. And we also get a lot of stuff with her behavior and facial expressions, a lot of exciting stuff. Now, due to popular demand, I couldn't do this analysis alone. Last week, I had a guest on the channel, and the feedback from you was incredible. And I personally also believe that he brought a lot to this analysis from a very different but enormously valid perspective. And so I decided to have him back for part 3, but we're doing this in a different way. Because there was so much material in this one episode to look at, I split it into 2 kind of categories. The stuff that's interesting to look at from a behavioral standpoint, and then the stuff that's interesting to look at from a psychiatric standpoint, which is my guest's specialty. And as such, we put the first part right here on this channel. It's the video you're watching, and you're gonna hear a lot from me in this part with great input from him, but we're gonna focus on a lot of the behaviors in this episode. And then we put the other part, which dives a lot more into her psychological state and what's going on in her head and how likely these things are that she's saying, on his channel. So when you're done watching this video, head over to his channel. I don't know if his video is up yet, but it will be very soon. So if it's not, just check in again. But we're splitting this into 2 parts. You're watching one part here and the other part is on his channel. So once again, my very exciting guest this week is a forensic psychiatrist based in London, and it's his job to go into courtrooms, prisons, and locked psychiatric units and assess mentally disordered offenders. He's also an expert witness in a lot of criminal trials. So this is literally his job, to look at the behaviors of individuals and try to assess if he believes there's something going on with their psychology. So back by popular demand, welcome back to the channel. Once again, Dr. Shahom Daz. What's going on, man?
Hello, Mr. Spidey. Thank you so much for having me back on. I'm excited about putting this case to rest and just getting through the final bits of this very, very bizarre woman.
Yes, sir. I'm excited as well. But don't thank me for being back here, because it's like a community here at the Behavioral Arts and the Tribe Has Spoken. I don't think they would have allowed me to do this without you. So I don't have much of a say here, but I'm really excited. Let's dive right in, starting with this.
He's telling me that I was coming home soon, it would all be over soon. I just had to keep following his instructions. He told me what he thought I wanted to hear, that he was supporting me, that I was coming home, that everything would be okay.
Had a couple extra little prayers and just said, you're coming home soon, sweetheart. Caylee's gonna be home soon, so we can be that family again.
So Doc, right off the bat here, I wanted to ask you, because this is one of the rare times we're seeing the interaction between just the 2 of them, George and Casey. And there might be nothing here, but I was curious to get your thoughts on this. Are we seeing here between the 2 of them the relationship that she's described? One of fear and complicity, and maybe we're not seeing it here, maybe we are. I would love to get your thoughts as to what you're seeing here.
Sure. So, it doesn't seem to me that she's in fear of her father at this moment in time. She's painted this narrative of control and dominance. Doesn't look like that to me at all. It looks like absolute relief and maybe a flood of emotions, maybe even some comfort in his words. And I know from other footage that I've seen that she's been the opposite of that. She's been quite callous and cold in her interactions in prison with her parents. So it feels like this emotion has just built up and built up and built up for whatever reason, whether she knows something that everybody else doesn't know or not. And it's just this floodgate of emotions that are coming out. But it doesn't feel like she's sort of petrified of his next move. So that's what I think in terms of their interactions. What about you? What do you think about the body language?
Yeah, so with the body language, we're getting something really interesting from her. And I would agree with one word you used, which is comfort. The moment he says, we're going to get Caylee home, Kaylee's coming home, we see a smile of comfort. We see her, she's looking down, she's feeling vulnerable, and we see that smile of comfort, but then there's a shift. That smile goes away as her hand comes up like this to block her eyes, and there's that hard squint. And this is a cluster that is very consistent with an unpleasant thought in one's head. So whenever we see the eyes close like this hard, typically speaking, one of two things is happening. One is either focus, really like we're really trying to get an image in our head, or two, there's an image that we're having a hard time dealing with, especially with that hand coming up like this to block. Sometimes we see it like this, very consistent with that. What's interesting about that is we see this gesture even in children that were born blind, which tells us a lot because they don't really have a need to do that. So it is kind of built into our subconscious. So I think at that point, personally, she's getting that comfort, like, oh, Kaylee's gonna come home, his words are comforting, but then she remembers something that makes her go, oh, I don't think that's gonna happen. It's one of the rare moments where I see something in her body language that makes me go, there's more here, there's more in this moment that's going on in her head.
Yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. And I suppose the other thing that strikes me is that the father is clearly saying that he's praying for Caylee to return. So what does that mean? Is there a shared lie? If we're to believe Casey, then she's saying that they're both kind of involved in a shared lie between them because they both know that's not the case.
Yeah, you know what? I'm so glad you brought this up because I that's what I was wondering. So according to her, he has Caylee. And now he's saying, I'm praying for Caylee to come home. And there isn't even an ounce of her going, Dad, I thought you had her. Because maybe it's being recorded. So maybe they're in this shared little theater they're putting on, but there isn't even a little bit of her going, wait, what do you mean? Dad, I thought you have her. There's none of that.
Yeah. To me, it seems that what he's saying feels more genuine. I can't, say with 100% certainty that it is, but it just seems more genuine than the belief that they're both within this kind of shared lie.
Yeah, exactly. And there's no part of her that seems confused by the fact that he doesn't seem to know where Caylee is. I don't feel that there's some narrative they're masking together.
At 2:51 that afternoon, someone searches for the term foolproof suffocation. That computer was started up at 2:49 that afternoon.
Do you remember the internet searches? At 2:49, whilst Casey's cell phone is pinging a tower nearest the home, the Anthony's family desktop computer is activated by someone using Casey's password-protected account. At 2:51, someone does a search for foolproof suffocation.
Wasn't me. I can tell you that. Everyone had each other's passwords because it was the family computer.
Do you think it's possible your dad did that 2:51 p.m. search if he was at work at 3?
Where he worked and where our house was located was less than 10 minutes. There was enough time for him to have been home, still made those searches, and then left for work.
So a couple of things occurred to me after I look at that clip. Firstly, the thing about the passwords, anything's possible. I'm not saying she's 100% lying, but it just seems unusual to me. Why, if you have a family computer that everybody has access to and everyone's sharing, why even bother putting a password on it in the first place? That seems very odd to me. Surely it's just simpler to not have a password than create one and share it. It defeats the purpose of having a password in the first place. I suppose the other thing is that her suggestion that her father, George, just about managed to quickly do this Google search and then bolt. I don't know. I've never looked up how to suffocate somebody on Google, but if I did, I imagine I'd be quite invested in it. It's not like a random errand that I would suddenly do. I wouldn't fit it in between my, shopping list and all my other chores. I'd probably spend a lot of time and effort thinking about it, unless it was a panicky last minute search. But if you're looking for the correct way to suffocate somebody without detection, then that's pre-planned, right? It's not like Googling how to hide a body or something. So it just doesn't add up to me. I don't see a scenario where somebody, especially an ex-cop, is, very clumsily Googling something in between doing all these other things. That's what I think. What about you?
Completely agreed, especially because with your first part, she's been very clear about the fact that she was hiding a lot from her family at this point, where she was working, where her daughter, who was taking care of her daughter, she had a lot of secrets that she was hiding. She was secretly planning to move away, according to her testimony. So yeah, she's not going to have a password that everyone else knows when she's hiding that much. That was my instinct. The second thing that jumped out at me here is, like you said, we're talking about an ex-cop here. I don't think an ex-cop is Googling suffocation on a computer knowing that this is the kind of thing that they can easily find, history search. So I suppose for me at the end of the day, there's two narratives. One is what we call Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a philosophical standpoint that the simplest solution to something is usually the right one. So if we apply that here, and if we look at, it's not just the search, by the way. If we look at that document, it says that shortly after, the person went on MySpace, which is a website she used and he didn't. So the simplest answer is she was using that computer to search.
And hang on, if she's saying that he went back to work almost immediately afterwards, then he surely wouldn't have enough time to figure out how to kill somebody and then go on MySpace, would he?
Right. So that's what I'm saying. Occam's razor tells us it was probably her making the searches. But if we apply the CSI Miami, like secret plot twist, I suppose there's a slight possibility where he did something awful and then he decided to frame her. So he went on the computer and used her password to search this thing. And then it's unlikely. It's an exciting narrative, but I feel, I don't know how you feel, I feel it's unlikely.
I mean, if he was trying to frame her, then I think he would make more of an effort than just one random internet search. And he would have nudged the investigators towards that search, knowing that it's there. It just seems a bit of a tepid attempt to try and frame somebody to do that one search at one time and then nothing else.
Great point. As a reminder, the prosecutor, there was an oversight. They didn't bring this up in court. And if he had this big plot to frame her, he'd make sure it came up somehow. So that's a really solid point. In terms of her body language, again, there's a lot of challenges here because with this documentary, I'm assuming that she knew what questions were coming up next and had time to retake certain things. But right in the beginning, we see a very clear freeze. Like she's pacifying a little or using those adapters, pacifiers, adapters, same thing where she's kind of rubbing the hands like this. This is a just for stress, self-soothing. But then she freezes up as that question's coming in. And usually when we freeze up, it is consistent with an increased cognitive load where we're thinking the brain's working overtime, so we freeze to not draw attention to ourselves. We see a freeze there. So I do think there's a lot going on in her head in anticipation of how she's going to answer this question.
So what does that mean? Does that mean that there's a possibility of what she's saying isn't the truth because it takes more effort to lie? Is that?
It could be. I would need to see a heck of a lot more to say, I think this is fabrication, because it can also be her really just trying to remember what's going on with these searches and things like that. Which actually brings me to another point. So Dr. Dawes, I want you to do this, as well as all the viewers. Put yourself in Caylee's position. So you're seeing that there was a search on the family computer that says foolproof suffocation. And you didn't do that search. Wouldn't you think that this is the most incriminating thing for your dad? Like she's been saying in part 2, I don't want to accuse him of murder, but there's this search that you didn't do. Wouldn't you be like, look dead into that camera and go, guys, I didn't make this search, but someone in my house did. This isn't an accident. Wouldn't you be begging the viewers to be like, guys, wake up? She's on the defense here. She's very defensive with this. She's like, well, he could have done this. He could have done that. It wasn't me. Whereas if it was me and someone told me that there was a search done on my computer for foolproof suffocation, I know I didn't do that, I would be a bloodhound. Does that make sense?
No, that totally makes sense, yeah.
Let me know in the comments, everyone, would that not be like, if you didn't make that search, would you not just go after him like a savage when you were told that this search was done on the computer? It kind of feels off to me that she's really defensive about this as opposed to going straight offense.
It's almost like a slightly awkward, uncomfortable point that she can't avoid rather than, as you said, this should be proof, this is the focus, yeah. I agree. See your point, yeah.
So that's the situation we have with George. Why did he want his daughter to die? For an accident? So the real question is, if you were telling people behind the scenes it was an accident, would you testify as a star witness in a trial that would get your child death for that accident?
I have never heard that before. And that's shocking. Why, if you did think it was an accident, would you want the death penalty? That doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so Dr. Dawes, this clip actually, I was really excited to talk to you about because our fields are separate, but there are certain things that connect what we do. And one of those things is very much avoiding leading questions. Because in my line of work, interview, interrogation, a leading question can open up a really bad can of worms and a slippery slope. And in your line of work, you could talk to us a little bit about this, but if you ask leading questions, you can put ideas in the mind of the person you're assessing, I would imagine. And here we're getting something that I don't know if it irritated you the way it irritated me, but let's talk about leading questions, Dr. Daz.
Sure, absolutely. So as you say, in my psychiatric assessments, I'm trained not to use them because you don't get a fair picture or narrative of what the patient in front of you actually thinks. However, as when I'm cross-examined by barristers in criminal trials, they often do use leading questions. So that's exactly like the kind of tactics that they do to try and discredit some of the evidence if it doesn't suit their particular side. In terms of this actual footage, yeah, I completely agree. So the interviewer is implying that George is intentionally being the star witness because he wants Caylee to fail. He wants her to be found guilty. He wants the death
Her to
penalty.
die.
Her to die.
She
Yeah,
says,
yeah,
like,
yeah. The death
she says
penalty.
he
But
wants her to die.
surely what he wants is for the truth to be found, for justice for Caylee. And he doesn't know definitively at that point whether Casey's responsible or not. Like, he suspects it, but he doesn't know that for a fact, and he suspects it for good reason. You know, it's not just there was an accident, she ended up in prison on remand. There was an accident, she misled the police, she seemingly didn't tell anybody. It's different from her narrative, but objectively she didn't tell anybody or let anybody know, including George, for a number of days, for almost an entire month. So it's more than just what the interviewer is implying. And finally, I'd say that I think it's a bit of a stretch or a bit presumptive to say that George wants the death penalty. He doesn't get to choose. He just gives evidence, as is his role as a witness in the case. And he'll know that as a police officer. But he doesn't choose anything to do with the punishment. What do you think, Spidey?
Completely agreed. And I think one of the things you touched on is we're talking about an ex-cop, someone who devoted his life to law enforcement. He's being subpoenaed by the state to come in and answer some questions. I think it's a false equivalence to say he wants her to die. That's not, he's there to answer questions. That's the way I look at that. Again, not defending George Anthony and washing his hands of all involvement, but I think it's a false equivalence. And you're making a documentary here. I think leading questions should be avoided. That's my thought. I want to talk about really quickly the second gentleman, the one with the short hair, who lived with her. And we've seen numerous times throughout this documentary. I'm going to give you guys a little peek behind the curtain of mentalism, what I do professionally. So mentalists are entertainers who use trickery, psychology, nonverbal communication to make it seem like we can read your thoughts. And Dr. Daz, I know you're a fan of mentalism. You've seen a couple of shows out in England. There's some amazing mentalists. And something mentalists do quite often is cold reading. And cold reading is a process where we use observations, deductive reasoning, nonverbal communication. This is where I apply a lot of what I've learned in body language and nonverbal communication and behavior analysis. So we look at someone and we understand certain things about the way they function and we say it to them. I'm getting the sense that blah, 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 blah. Now, mentalists use it for entertainment only, strictly. It's very important. There's people out there who use it to convince you that they can read your thoughts or they can communicate with certain things. I don't like that. I use it strictly for entertainment. But I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a sneak peek as to one of the things that I do when I do my mentalism. I look for specific things, certain binaries in people, and for what I see, I have a script. And one of the binaries that I look for is something I call Occam's razor versus conspiracy theorist. So there are people out there in the world who apply Occam's razor, which is basically, once again, the simplest answer to something is probably the right one. So they look for facts, data, and just follow what is most likely. Then you have the opposite of that, conspiracy theorists, who, with very little evidence, they like to follow the exciting narrative. They like that there's something else to uncover here that gets them excited. And in today's world of social media, this is very present. And I can spot that difference very quickly. For example, Dr. Daz, it's painfully obvious to me within the first few minutes that we met that you apply Occam's razor. You follow the logic, and what seems to be most likely, that's what you go with. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome.
In fact, for the medico-legal work, we have to analyze everything on the balance of probability. So it's literally been drummed into me since I was a junior doctor. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I'm using a lot of that. I'm using your profession. I'm using the way you speak. I'm using a lot of different things to know that. When we look at that second guy, the one with the short hair, black shirt, he is the definition of someone who is prone to believe in conspiracy theories. Even look at the way he took that information. Well, what do you make of George Anthony, testifying for the death penalty? He's like, oh my God. Like he's all excited. He's all, oh, there's something to uncover here. And his mind just goes nuts on him. He does this numerous times. Okay, now we're gonna dive deeper into her narrative and get some details that when we back up and look at the whole picture, just do not make any sense. But before we do me a huge favor, hit that like button. It really does help with the success of these videos. Hit that subscribe button, turn those notifications on for more behavioral analysis and practical psychology content.
I remember my father said something during the course of my case. I don't remember if it was in an interview, but he said he used to love the sweet smell of Caylee's sweat.
Casey, he said that at Caylee's funeral.
Was it really? Of course he did. What better way to memorialize your granddaughter than to tell the world that you were abusing her too? I'm gonna need a minute. I need a minute, sorry. I didn't remember that it was that. I wasn't there, I was in jail. I just remember being told that it was said.
So that was pretty emotional. And I know there's a lot of people out there saying she's acting and she's putting it on. And yes, there's a lot of evidence in a lot of these clips where there's a lot of embellishing and a lot of overacting. But in this moment, it certainly seems like something really emotional is hitting her. And I go back to the fact that the gray area exists a lot of the time. Not everything has to be on an extreme. It's possible that she's hiding something, that there's more to this narrative than she's telling us, but there's also real emotion here, that a part of her actually misses her daughter. But there's two things I want to talk about here. The first one is there's a leap there, a leap in logic that we'll come back to. But the second thing is a question that I want to ask you, Dr. Daz.
Sure.
Is this kind of thing normal? So she's remembering something that obviously is impacting her, something that is convincing her that her father has admitted to abusing Caylee. Would it be normal for her to not remember where she heard that or where that information is coming from? So there's a debate in my head. Half of me is going, I don't know, if it's that important and you think it's that incriminating, you would remember exactly when he said it. But another part of me is going, it was such a mess, so much going on at the time, so maybe it's possible. So is it normal that something of this much importance to her, she can't remember the details of where she would have heard that?
Sure, good question. So I think in a sort of typical, everyday, normal circumstances, it would be very unusual and almost not explainable that she wouldn't remember where she heard her father say that. But I think in this particular case, I think it's understandable because we have to remember that this whole period was absolute chaos and turmoil. I'm sure she had multiple conversations with detectives interrogating her defense team, her actual parents when they came to visit her in prison when she was on remand. She probably saw clips of interviews of herself on TV. So I imagine in this kind of minefield of trauma and emotion at the time, I think it is feasible that she might have forgotten exactly where she heard that one comment because so much was going on. That's what I think.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Thank you for that. That does really clarify it for me because I was very confused as to whether or not that was possible. But Dr. Daz, let's talk about this leap that we both noticed. I'm not saying that statement makes you go, oh, how sweet. The fact that he misses the smell of her sweat. I'm not saying it's the sweetest thing I've ever heard. I can see how somebody would look at that and go, it's a little weird. It's not something I would say. But I also don't think, and you can touch on this, that it's the most incriminating thing in the world. And by the way, we're going to look at that clip. We're going to, on your channel, we're analyzing different scenes and we're looking at his speech. And we're hearing him say that, and in context, in the way he says it, I think it's even less noteworthy. But she seems to really be impacted by that. So why don't you tell us about this? Is it because her mind is looking for that because she sees him in this frame? Do you also feel like it's a massive gap? Do you think it's merited? Talk to us.
Sure. So, I mean, I think we touched on this, didn't we, during the last recording of the video for the last part that we recorded, which is that we know that Casey has told many lies, many untruths to a number of people at a number of points, including lying to the police. We should be very careful to not assume that she's not a victim of abuse or that she's lying about that, right? Frankly, I certainly don't know whether that's true or not. If it is true, then I can understand why she would be petrified that her father might be abusive towards Caylee, and she might worry that he abused her. I can understand that. But I'd have to say respectfully, that statement doesn't indicate abuse in my view, like missing the sweet smell of Caylee's sweat. It's a slightly odd thing to say, but I mean, it's not a sexual statement in my view. That's not an indication of abuse at all. And secondly, why would he even say that? It wouldn't make sense. If he really is guilty of everything that Casey says, then, you know, he'd be keeping his mouth shut. He wouldn't be like dropping little subtle breadcrumbs of indicating that he abused her. So yeah, I don't really understand where Casey's coming from.
If you put abuse goggles on me, so you have me look at someone and you tell me this person's an abuser and he makes that statement, I might go, oh yeah, weird. But if you don't put those goggles on me, if you put the goggles of like sweet grieving grandfather, then I'd look at it and go, he misses his granddaughter. Yeah. But we also have to consider that he would also have those goggles. He knows that this is being filmed, it's being broadcast, and if in his head, he knows that that's his role, that he's done horrible things, he would be very careful with the words that could be used against him. I think, especially once again, as an ex-cop. So once again, I'll say this again and again, I'm not saying he's a sweet little saint, but to me there's a bit of a leap there between what he said and going, I can't believe he would just admit that he did this based on that statement. I don't see it as an admission of guilt.
Yeah, I completely agree. Neither do I.
She was never left alone with my dad, not even when she was an infant. Because I know what I lived through. As a kid who was abused, that was my fear.
That she wouldn't be safe.
That she wouldn't be safe.
Okay, so again, I'm totally with you that just because we know she's lied about a ton of other stuff doesn't mean we need to assume that she's lying about abuse. Typically, that's something you want to take very seriously and treat separately. And in that effort, in the last video, part 2, we looked at a lot of her testimony pertaining to him being an abusive father. And you said there were a lot of fluctuations in when she remembered this. But there was a letter that she wrote in jail, and she even said that most of these memories came back to her while she was in jail. That they weren't really, like they were there, but not really accessible to her before jail. And there's a letter in jail that she wrote that clearly says that she had some dreams, and based on those dreams, she thinks that her father did certain things. Now we have something different, don't we? Because here she's saying that she never let Caylee around her father when she was an infant because he was abusive. So now, way before jail, way before Caylee went missing, you're behaving in ways to protect your daughter from him with the knowledge that he's abusive. But that's not what was reflected in part 2 when she talked about how she didn't remember these things until she was in jail. So once again, Dr. Oz, I don't know if you agree, but for me, there's this, throughout this whole thing, there's an inconsistency of when she remembers his behaviors. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was a word that we used several times during the last episode that we recorded. I don't think we've used it that often yet, but I think we're about to. So inconsistency is the key word for me. So inconsistencies you've just highlighted. So there's a big difference between these fragmented, vague, uncertain memories of potential abuse that were kind of rekindled when she was in prison versus obviously clear kind of memories if she's so scared about the safety of Caylee that she's literally keeping her away from her father, or at least not leaving them unaccompanied. Number one. even more to me, that the other inconsistency that stood out even more was the very fact that her behavior when whatever happened to Caylee happened is completely inconsistent with that. So she let her father walk away at one point, unsure of whether Caylee was safe, whether she was alive, without chasing him. She just let him walk away, apparently in fear. If she's been protective of Caylee for several years of her life, why would she let that happen? And why would she kind of act in, or seemingly, on the surface at least, act indifferently, nonchalantly, going off and partying for 31 days, if she was that fearful for Caylee's safety for that whole period of time? Again, it's just inconsistent. So something doesn't add up. So she's not telling the truth one way or the other.
100% agreed. And I'm so glad you brought it back to that, because yes, first of all, we're getting this fluctuation of when she remembered his behaviors. Then we have the inconsistency of her saying that she would never leave him alone, but then for a month she did. And then there's something else I want to bring up while we're talking about the letter she wrote in jail, and we're talking about him having her and her keeping her from him. I gave a lot of thought last week after our video to several elements that we talked about. That letter was one of them. You know how significant that letter was for me and how excited I was about analyzing that letter. And I realized something else. And this is the first time I'm presenting this to you, Dr. Daz, is the fact that she was confiding to that friend of hers in jail, right? Saying things for the first time, like saying to her things about like abuse. I think I was abused. I'm having these memories unlocked. She was really confiding in her. But not once in that letter did she mention, I'm terrified because my father has my daughter. Like, you're confiding in this woman in jail. You're telling her things you haven't told anyone else. You're even saying, I feel comfortable sharing things with you. But in the confidence of that letter, she never once mentioned that she's scared. Because in that moment, according to her narrative, she thought that her dad had Caylee. It's not mentioned once in that letter while she's confiding to her friend. I find that rather suspicious. That while she's opening up to his friend, she'll say, by the way, I haven't told anyone this, but he's got her and I'm terrified.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me ask you this, Spidey. Do you think that she knew that that letter would potentially become evidence and become exposed and become public? Do you think she knew that?
It's a terrific question. But all the more reason, like, if she thought... So neither one would justify why it's not in there for me. Because if she thought, bear with me, if she thought it wasn't going to be evidence, she would confide in her friend. If she thought it was going to be evidence, they presented this narrative in court that he had her. So she would have maybe slipped it in there as a preemptive way to kind of get people to believe that that narrative was true. So there, in neither scenario would I understand why she wouldn't mention in the letter.
Yeah. So what scenario doesn't make sense? I suppose there is that
it didn't happen.
It's not true, and that she kind of retrospectively invented it. Yeah.
So that's what you know what? Let me say that flat out. My viewers know that I'm very, very serious about not being polarized. That I like to stay in the objective middle, in the gray area, and allow my viewers to take these observations and form their own opinion. But of all the things with Casey Anthony, there's one thing I refuse to believe. And that is the fact that she thought during those 31 days that Caylee was safe with George. I don't know the truth of what happened, the details of how much she knows, how much she's hiding. I can never know that based on behavior. But I absolutely do not personally believe that for their 31 days, she thought Caylee was with George. I don't believe that to be true.
You felt that your dad had basically kidnapped her.
And was keeping her from me, yes.
Even though you felt that body in your arms and you knew that something was terribly wrong.
Told me she was going to be okay. It's what I chose to accept. There's that little girl inside of me that wanted to believe he wouldn't hurt her the way he hurt me.
And you didn't think that there was any way she could have drowned and he found her in the pool?
No, she had no way of getting in the pool. There was nothing for her to have shimmied up. To me, there's no way of explaining that. Unless he put her in the... Unless he put her in the pool to cover up what he did.
So quite a lot going on there that I want to talk about. Some good stuff with body language. When she's asked, even as you felt that body in your arms, because she testified in part 2 that when she got outside, he gave her the body and she held it and felt cold and heavy and wet, and then he took her back and left. So now she's being asked, you thought she was safe this whole time, even if you felt that. And the moment that body is brought up, we see a very distinct cluster of behaviors. We see a lip compression as her lips thin out, like this. We see a slow blink at the same time. Her blink slows down. And she starts nodding and cuts off the interviewer.
Her arms, and you knew that something was terribly wrong.
Told me she was going to be okay.
As if she's in a rush to address that. So that cluster for me, what it indicates, first of all, lip compression again is withheld opinion or disagreement. So when we're holding something back or we disagree, you might see that lip compression. Slow blink, going back to what I said earlier, eye blocking, any eye blocking gesture is an unpleasant thought, something that we're internalizing our thoughts, and often we really are having a hard time visualizing it or don't want to. And then she cuts her off. Here's what I think is happening in that moment. I think she regrets ever having said that she held the body. I think afterwards she thought about it and said, no, I just should have said I came out, I saw him with Caylee, he walked in, that's it. I think she knows that having had that body in her hands makes it more unlikely that she thought Caylee was safe. So I think in this moment when that's brought up, that slow blink and lip compression is like, I really shouldn't have said that. Almost like without opinion or disagreement with herself. And eye blocking like, yeah, do you see what I'm saying? Like that cluster, like someone says something and you go, like you're having a hard time dealing with it.
And also, did I get this right, Spidey? Did she say that after she held the body, she still didn't know whether Caylee was alive or dead or safe or not?
Exactly.
And that's, I mean, it's not impossible, but it's just not feasible, is it? It's your own child who you think might have died, literally put in your arms. Like,
why did you give her back? Exactly, why did you not try to, hey, Caylee, are you okay? So that's exactly it. So I think she's going, not my proudest moment. Do you see how that's consistent with that? Look, if I go like, not my best moment. You know what I mean? So that's what we're getting there. And that's why I think she nods and immediately addresses it. She cuts off the interview, be like, no, yeah, I did. Let's move on. So she's in a rush to get past this because she knows it's not her best moment. Make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Dr. Dawes, I'm going to ask you this. Given how there are certain moments where we're seeing real emotion, real grief, given how she's presenting these things that are very contradictory, and she's presenting it in a way where she doesn't see how conflicting they are, is it possible that in time, to deal with this, to deal with her own demons, she's convinced herself of certain things that aren't true? And I mean in fact. She believes in fact things that don't represent reality. Is it possible?
Sure. Not really. No, not in fact. And I'm glad you made that distinction, but absolutely in emotion. So firstly, you do get mental illnesses where you have actual delusions. So those are fixed beliefs in something that are not true. They tend to be very bizarre, typically, or paranoid or grandiose, not, factual matters about whether somebody drowned a child or not. But I don't think we're seeing that at all because you get other sort of signs of mental illness here. In terms of my clinical experience, having assessed lots of defendants during criminal trials, I've had many people lie to me and I found out retrospectively that they're lying. And the one thing that I would say is that often they can be very much invested in the emotion that they've come to cultivate over a period of time. So I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think that she would believe fully in the facts if she's lying about what happened, but she can convince herself of the emotional feeling. She can still invest and feel the emotion. She can feel wrong. She can feel victimized. She can feel outraged, even though it's not factually biased. And that can increase over time with practice.
The ladder wasn't on the pool, so she got
So none of that really, it didn't.
None of it makes sense.
Didn't make total sense,
Well, my thought was that he was using that as a way to cover up. Even then, what he had done.
Whatever this accident was that he had done to Caylee. George was involved, and I don't think the accident was in the pool.
He'd put a pillow over my face and he'd smother me to knock me out. That happens.
Really?
That happens several times.
That could be the accident.
Possible.
To stop noises, to grab a pillow, and that would be the accident.
Okay, so I kind of want to end where we ended last week with this clip. But before we get to that, I want to say this. The gentleman she's talking to, who she's become quite close to and works with now, who hired her and sheltered her after the trial, is the investigator who was part of her legal team. It was his job to investigate all the details. So right now they're turning on the narrative that was presented at trial, right? At trial, her lawyers presented that Caylee accidentally drowned in the pool. That was what won this case for her. Now, not just her, but the investigator who was part of her legal team is turning on that narrative. So is he admitting that he didn't do his work back then and properly investigate and ask these questions? Because right now he's asking these questions for the first time. Why didn't you have this conversation with her during the trial? It's confusing to me. Not that she's just turning on the narrative from the courtroom, but him as well. And he was on the legal team. So he's saying, no, what we presented, what I found back then wasn't right. And now he's digging even more. But why didn't you have this conversation with her before, during the trial? Why are you learning for the first time that these are things that he did when she was younger? Why?
That is very confusing to me. On the assumption that he knows what he's doing, that he's a professional, I can only assume that he did ask, not all of the questions in detail because he didn't have this second theory, but he would have asked some general questions to see if there were other possibilities. He must have done, otherwise there'd be no difference in picking like a random person from a supermarket to come in and investigate. These are very basic elements. So I'm only assuming that she didn't really give him any information or answers or descriptions that would lead to any alternative narrative, which begs the question, why is he not suspicious? If I was an investigator, if I was a detective and I'd found something from interviewing, not a suspect, but interviewing a person involved in a case, and then after the trial, the story changed, I would be, it's possible that, new information comes to light, but if new information hasn't come to light, I'd be hugely suspicious of that person. So I get your skepticism. I get why that it's confusing. It seems like they're two people kind of grieving a sad situation together rather than him being an objective investigator of what happened.
Exactly, and I'm so glad you said that. I don't have a problem with your opinion changing. If you don't, then you're stubborn and you're stuck in your opinion, and I hate that. But new information changes your opinion. The stuff she's saying here would have been things she would have known at the time of the trial. She's not introducing anything that happened since then or anything that was discovered since then. This is stuff she would have known. So are you blatantly admitting that by not asking her these questions during the trial, you didn't do your job? And are you admitting that by changing your narrative now and having let the lawyers present that narrative during the trial, that you didn't do your job? Is that what I'm getting? It feels like that's what I'm getting.
Or are you now saying that she's giving you new bits of information that were pertinent to the trial that she didn't disclose to you at the time when she should have done?
Right. And if that's the case, why aren't you skeptical? Like you said, there's no path where he comes off as a credible investigator. Because either he didn't get all the information initially, or he's getting new information now that contradicts that stuff, and he's not, that red flag, that red investigator flag isn't going off on the back of his head. I know there are a lot of investigators who follow this channel, and I'm very thankful for that, and I've gotten so many great testimonials from a lot of them saying that a lot of this behavioral stuff has helped them improve their interviewing skills. But let me know in the comments, if you're an investigator, let me know in the comments, did this make sense to you? The fact that he's almost open about the fact that there are certain things he didn't ask her that would have been pertinent to the case back then. And he let the lawyers present something that now he's turning on without new information. The second thing, and I'm excited to share this with you, is this. If this is what happened, if this is the narrative, why the heck would he Google how to suffocate someone?
Yeah, actually, you're right.
Unless we go back to the CSI Miami, he's trying to frame her thing. After it happened, he's like, I'm going to go on her account and search this on her password protected account, then go on MySpace to frame her, which is exciting. But again, it's like, it's not following the facts, it's following the conspiracy. Why would he have Googled that? This, as you said, this Google search was not something to cover up an accident. It was a how-to.
Yeah.
So why would he Google that?
Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, I completely agree with you. The two things can't be correct. She can only have one type of accusation. She can only be alleging one thing or the other. You can't have both, can you? So yeah, I agree with you. It is very, very bizarre.
And here's the thing, she's not even alleging that he's framing her. She's alleging that those searches must have been him. He must have done those searches. And now she's saying he must have done this. The two can't coexist.
They can't.
But I want to end this video where we ended the last video, part 2, because Dr. Dawes, as you know, I was very stuck at the end of part 2 as to why she's shifting the narrative, because very often if someone's making something up or they're lying and there's a narrative that kind of works, they tend to latch onto that and go, yeah, let's go with this. It worked on the jury, I'm just going to go with this. But she turned on it. She turned on the narrative that worked. She turned on the narrative that won her the case. And now she's presenting something completely new, knowing it could be detrimental to her. And you had some amazing theories as to why that is. And I encourage the viewers to go back and watch part 2 to see what those really great theories were. But after that, as I was editing, thinking about it, and reading the very amazing comments from this amazing community that I love so much, I came to a realization. And that realization, and this is something a lot of you were hinting at, some of you said, and Dr. Daz, I think you were also kind of headed in this path, and the realization was the following. If she sticks to that narrative of this was an accident, which is what won her the case, she's still a neglectful parent. And that doesn't work for her narcissism. The only narrative that works for her narcissism is to say, it was completely out of my hands. He took her, I wasn't aware. He did something, I wasn't aware. You still have to explain why you went on partying for a month, but she can live with herself a little bit more if the narrative that's out there is that she didn't have anything to do directly with the death. Because if it was an accident, she's still a shit parent.
So when you said all that, 2 phrases jumped out to me, one of which I'm sure we've used before, one of which I'm not sure if we have. So one is external locus of control. So people who are either antisocial or narcissistic are unwilling to take the blame. So everything's somebody else's fault. Everything is the situation they were put in. Number 1. And number 2 is damage control. I think that she knows that it's a really bad look and that she can't really hide away because the case was so gained so much notoriety and she came out looking bad. A lot of people think she's guilty of the death of her daughter. And even if she's not, she comes out looking really bad as a neglectful parent. So it's almost like her ego is so fragile, she's so narcissistic that she seemingly seems to be saying things that might not be true. I don't know that definitively, but that's what it appears to me to be a great possibility, because she would rather do that and change the entire narrative and the perspective of the public than continue living in a life where other people will question her as a bad parent.
Yep, which goes right back to what you said at the end of the last video, which is she would almost rather risk not being believed if there's a chance that she comes off looking less bad. Yeah. So there it was, everyone. We have reached the end of our Casey Anthony Where the Truth Lies journey. This was amazing for me to hear Dr. Daz's opinions and to really explore more than just the behavior here and get insight as to why, given her narcissism, she does things the way that she does them. I think at the end of the day, we're pretty much in agreement that there's just so many inconsistencies. There's things that don't add up. So does that mean for a fact that we can know that she's guilty of taking Caylee's life and doing something horrible? No. There's no amount of behavior or body language analysis that can tell us for sure exactly what she did. But I think we can pretty confidently state that there are too many inconsistencies here. Something is being concealed, and that with the same amount of ease that she was lying back then about certain things, she's still lying today about certain things. The extent of it, I don't think anybody can know. We can speculate, but there's just too many things that don't add up. But let me know in the comments what you thought of this whole thing, specifically of this part. Make sure to head over to Dr. Daz's channel to catch the rest of this analysis. A lot of really great stuff there, and I will see you really soon.